this is Dr. Ken with the introductory lecture for my Chaucer's England module, and this is just for them, although anyone is welcome to watch if they want. So in this introductory lecture, which I shall keep relatively short and to the point, I'm going to go over the study of our subject, which is 14th century English history, and how we're going to go about it in this class. I'll go over the topics one by one and explain the kind of approach that we're going to take. So, why study the 14th century? Well, this is one of the more interesting periods in British and European history. It's a time of great change and flux and social upheaval. It is, in many respects, the point at which the medieval period becomes the early modern period. It's also a very busy century. So what we get in the 14th century is, first of all, climate change that results in a famine towards the beginning. We get the start of what's called the Little Ice Age, which will last until about, the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century. Its effects are still felt in the early 20th century, but it affects climate at the time and crops. We also get, or they got rather, a plague in the form of the Black Death, which decimated the population of Britain and Europe, and had many lasting repercussions on society. This is highly relevant, I think, to us today, experiencing our own equivalent, and so we'll be talking about that and the sort of impact it had. There was in Europe, of course, the 100 Years' War with France between the Crown of England and the Crown of Europe, disputing over who should be in charge of France. It lasted more than 100 years, but was also a defining feature of the latter portion of the 14th century. And so there's that. This is also a period of religious upheaval. So we're getting, or they were getting, people like the Lollards coming along, questioning Catholic doctrine, a kind of proto-Reformation, in fact, and John Wycliffe translating the Bible into English for the first time, and there were some interesting political features behind that as well. So we get a kind of proto-Reformation. This is also a period of considerable difficulty for the Catholic Church, who experience what's called a Papal Schism, where they can't decide who's going to be Pope, and there are actually two popes throughout a good portion of the latter part of the 14th century, and at one point even three popes. So this century is unprecedented in many respects compared to all the ones, or many of the ones, that had preceded it, and that alone makes it worth studying. How do we go about studying the 14th century? I've got my little teaching assistant here, Bear. Say hello. Well, and part of the problem with this has to do with sources. There aren't that many. We have Froissart's Chronicle, which I put up on Blackboard for us to access. There are a few other chroniclers that exist, but it's not as well documented as some earlier periods or later ones. Part of the reason for this has to do with the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, in which tax offices were burnt, in which a lot of public records were destroyed. So we have limited sources. That's why it's called Chaucer's England. We're using the Canterbury Tales as a source on 14th century English life. And this is not a novel approach. The Canterbury Tales have been used for a long time now to provide evidence on what life was like in the 14th century. And we know, for example, what a peasant's house was like on the inside, thanks to descriptions in Chaucer and other things too. So we're thinking of the works of Chaucer not just as a kind of literary phenomenon, but although hopefully we can appreciate them for their literary qualities. I'm not asking you to read them in Middle English. I ask you to get a modern verse translation, but in addition to being interesting works of literature, they tell us volumes about many aspects of 14th century life. Chaucer himself, as we shall see, was plugged into the political spectrum in a very intimate way. He was a courtier for Edward III and Richard II as well, and was acquainted with and even married into some of the more notable families at the time. His wife was one of the handmaidens to the Queen, and his children would go on to become noble themselves. So Chaucer, the son of a vintner, a commoner by all accounts, ends up being a prominent courtier, and his granddaughter, Alice Chaucer, will become a duchess, ennobled. So he's done quite well for himself, and as I say, if anyone has a key insight into what life was like at the top in the 14th century, it's Geoffrey Chaucer. He was an MP. He was MP for Kent, and as I say, a courtier for Edward III and Richard II. So we'll be thinking about those aspects. We're interested in the Canterbury Tales as a text in context, and what that tells us, about 14th century life, the court, and other historical events at the time. So with that, I'm going to now go over the various themes that we're going to consider in each session, and I'll talk about those more in the seminar as well. For next week, what I'll be talking about is a kind of general introduction to Chaucer and the 14th century. We will think about some of these wider themes that I've been discussing today. And I've called it Chaucer in the calamitous 14th century. Calamitous is a word that's been used to describe it. I forgot to mention there was a crisis with the monarchy as well in England. So that will be some of the issues discussed. The following week we'll look at church, state, and society, the social order in Chaucer's England. And for that seminar, I'll ask you to have looked at the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales. You'll notice as well that for each week I've assigned a chapter of Ian Mortimer's The Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England. I recommend very strongly that you get this book. It will be tremendously useful in coming to terms with the context. It's not the only secondary source by any means, and there are many others. I've included extensive bibliography for each lesson, but I highly recommend that. This is why I've given a chapter for each lesson. So after Chaucer in the calamitous 14th century, we'll be introduced to aspects of church, state, and society as well. The next week we're looking at the social order, and that we'll consider the broader context. How did society work? There's talk of those who work, those who fight, and those who pray. This is the medieval social structure, but that's changing at this time. We'll think about local power struggles amongst the aristocrats and the barons, developments in religion and attitudes towards business, and pilgrimages as well, and shrines and holy relics. So we'll get to know the society a bit better, and we'll look at the Knights Prologue and tale for that. The knight is the highest status character amongst the Canterbury Pilgrims. They are a very good slice of English society, a selection from the whole range of the sort of people that you would find in medieval England. And the knight is the highest ranking one, pardon me, there, apart from Chaucer himself. Chaucer is actually a character in the Canterbury Tales. He was, of course, an MP, which makes him a Knight of the Shire. Not quite the same thing as a proper knight, as we think of them, but still high status. So we'll look at the Knight's Tale and Prologue, and I've given you another chapter from Mortimer's book, as well as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is part of the kind of literature that would have been popular at the time. So after that, we move on to mock heroism. And this, I think, relates quite well to Chaucer. When we get to the Knight's Tale, we'll decide whether we think it's sort of taking the piss out of the kind of epic tales that were popular amongst, or not, epic isn't the right term, but maybe heroic tales that are popular amongst the aristocracy, or whether it's meant to be taken genuinely, or both. But what either or, there is the contrast to that, which is the mock heroic tale, and there's plenty of that in Chaucer. Individuals get mocked by Chaucer and others, particularly within the church, and the gentry are, of course, not immune to this either. We'll talk about who the gentry are in time to come, nor indeed Chaucer himself. So we'll consider themes like mock heroism and parodies of the great romances that were popular in Chaucer's time, and we'll talk about some of those romances. And our reading for that will be the Nun's Priest Tale, the Tale of Sir Topaz, and Chaucer's Tale of Melody in synopsis form. And there's a chapter from the Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England in that reference to that as well. The following week, we'll think about challenges to the social order. Well, there was a social order, the medieval one, which persisted, that is the feudal society, but things are changing. And this isn't surprising given all that goes on in the 14th century. The challenges to the social order include crises amongst the nobility and royalty, violence amongst the aristocracy, the peasants' revolt, which I've mentioned already, religious dissent, and then the social and economic, probably the most important part really, is the social and economic upheaval of the Black Death. The population of England was possibly reduced by 1/2 as a result of the Black Death. So about 7 million people prior to it, about 4 million people, less than 4 million after. A change like that is not going to it's going to have a major impact on society, and indeed it did. So we'll think about how that worked and how these challenges to the feudal order can be evidenced, again from Chaucer's perspective, but others as well. So we have the Miller's Tale, the Cook's Tale, and Chaucer's retractions. He puts in a series of retractions in case his work offends anyone in the end. And there's a chapter of Mortimer's book with that as well. The next one is on Pride and Prejudices. In this, we're going to examine primarily those medieval prejudices commonly held about races and religions other than white Christians. Pardon me. Important to remember, and we will be aware of this more so as we progress, that everyone in England, for the most part, with very, very few exceptions, at the time were Christian, were Catholic Christian, no Protestants, apart from the Lollards when they come along. We'll talk about those. They're a minority. Everyone's Catholic. Pretty much everyone is white. So there are a number of prejudices and preconceptions about people like Muslims and Jews, and this comes out in Chaucer as well as in the wider society. So I've given you the Parson's Tale and the Prioress's Tale. And the other aspect of this has to do with the 7 deadly sins, as they're defined at the time, which is a key religious feature of that stage of Catholicism. It's somewhat less relevant perhaps today, or less prominent, but it was extremely prominent at the time, and in fact it relates very strongly to the Canterbury Tales themselves. So we have those sort of 2 big themes in the Pride and Prejudices section. Following that, social relations, gender, age, sex, and marriage. And we'll think about how medieval society differed from the modern in these respects. There are several of the Canterbury Tales are referred to as the marriage group. They explore gender and sexual politics in relation to men and women. Of course, you can imagine that women were obviously much more oppressed and of a lower status in society at the time than they are today. But one consequence apparently of the Black Death, at least, and possibly the wars with France, is that there are a lot more women pushed into the public sphere during the 14th century. It's a kind of temporary hiccup, if you like, in the broad history of male-female relations. But for a time, women are occupying a lot of roles that traditionally men had done. There are several examples of prominent leaders in Europe who are, and in England, who are women as well. So there's this Queen Isabella, the she-wolf of France, Edward III's mother, who for a time takes over the kingdom. There are several, again, prominent European ones too. And there's Alice Perrers, who is the mistress of Edward III, and quite a powerful woman in her own right. So one thing the Black Death, at least, or the era itself, seems to have afforded temporarily is a kind of freedom to women. And we'll explore some of that as evidenced by Chaucer and other sources. So it's the Wife of Bath's prologue and tale for that one, the Clerk's prologue and tale, and the Merchant's prologue and tale, all sort of provide contrasting views on this topic. The next one is Sacred Space. We think a bit more about the church and its relation to society as a whole. Obviously, it almost goes without saying that the church was incredibly, much more relevant to people's lives, whether they wanted it to be or not, at the time than it is today. It was integrated at every level of society. The parish church more or less defined the community, and of course the church's position in the hierarchy was quite higher than it is today. So we'll think about that, how it affected the landscape, how it affected architecture, and art, and all sorts of other things, and economics in particular. So we'll look at the Friar's prologue and tale, the Summoner's prologue and tale, the Pardoner's prologue and tale. And of course I've mentioned the Papal Schism. This is a crisis for the Catholic Church. The Church is probably as wealthy and powerful as it ever is during this period, but it's also fairly corrupt. And that comes out in Chaucer quite a bit, and not just in Chaucer. Part of the problem, of course, is that many of the clergy die as a result of the Black Death, and they're replaced by people who are a lot less educated, and perhaps a little bit more grasping and greedy. And so the gap between the ideal and the real, how the church ought to behave and how they actually behave, or how the members of the church behave, becomes more apparent. So greedy bishops and monks and people like that become commonplace figures, stereotypes with which the people are familiar, and it certainly comes out in Chaucer. Following that is secular space, so looking at what the ordinary people are getting up to. And one thing that happens as a result of the changed circumstances of the time is that a lot of the peasant class, the ones who would have otherwise been suppressed as a result of feudalism, are increasing their economic prosperity. There is an emerging middle class of professionals, and a lot of people who would be classed as just free peasants, but who are getting quite wealthy as a result. And again, Geoffrey Chaucer is a good example of this, who, he's from a middle class vintner's family, but becomes a courtier, and as I say, his grandchildren end up with noble titles. His son becomes Speaker of the House of Commons. It's a success story, and it's not the only one. And part of the reason why this can happen is that, again, so many people are dying. The Black Death takes away so many lives that someone has to fill those roles. So it's a period of economic change for commoners, and for the middle classes as well, and an erosion of the feudal system, moving away from a system that had dominated for the better part of 1,000 years. One example of one illustration of how much change has taken place in that century: clothing styles and shoe styles. They changed dramatically in the 14th century. And why is that important? Now, our styles change every couple of years. Well, throughout most of history, like from the Roman period up to the 14th century, clothing and shoe styles didn't change that much. But suddenly in the 14th century, everything changes. Tighter fitting trousers, form-fitting jackets, sleeves that are properly fitted and not just sort of loosely hanging. Buttons are used widely, much more so than they used to be. everything, and shoes, many different kinds of shoes, particularly the pointy ones, which are very popular at the time. This is indicative of some kind of major social shift, cultural shift, and it's happening, amongst the commoners, if you like. So we'll look at their world. We have spring break after that, and our last taught session is going to be on satirical space, which, of course, a lot of the Canterbury Tales, as we shall see, are satire. Pardon me, and satire points out the gap between the ideal and the real. But it's not the only example, and we'll think about things like misericords. These are carvings in churches on seats for priests to lean against when they do masses. They often depict satirical images which seem out of place in a church. There are stained glass windows. If you go to York Minster, you'll see a monkey funeral that seems to be aping the funeral of the Virgin Mary. And then the marginalia, of course, in manuscripts. We'll be looking at a lot of those too. What is the purpose of all this? It's an interesting subject, and it really, there's a lot more of this sort of satire in art and literature in the 14th century than in ones previous. So again, this is indicative of some kind of cultural shift. We'll look at the words of the host to the monk and the monk's tale for that one. And that's the end of our taught sessions. The final two classes will be for individual presentations. If you look at the module specification, I have presentations. You give presentations based on your essay questions, and I'll go over the essay questions now. You can think about those, and then in the seminar we'll talk more about procedural day-to-day stuff. So I'm now going to go over the essay questions, and this is something we can talk about a bit more during the seminar, but I will go through them now to talk about the different topics that are available to you. The first has to do with landscapes and the use of landscape or buildings alongside historiography as in terms of what they can tell us about the 14th century. This is important again because we lack primary sources, so we have to think about landscape as a primary source, or architecture, or both. One example of this, which we'll talk about in more detail later, is the rig and furrow, as it's called, the type of ploughing that was used. You can still see parts of the landscape in England that had this type of farming technique used on it, and that tells you something about it. And again, there are other examples. Obviously, the architecture is a big one. The Gothic style, the perpendicular style of architecture that develops during this period speaks volumes about the culture. So we'll talk more about that in time to come, and you can ask me questions if you want to do that question. Next one is the Canterbury Tales an accurate representation of the English Church in the later 14th century, and are its criticisms of this institution correct? Obviously, it's going to be hard to say absolutely is it an accurate representation because of our lack of primary sources, but we'll take into account what we know and how Chaucer represents the church, or specifically how he represents individuals within the church. There is no explicit criticism of the church itself as an institution, but there is a lot of criticism of its members for their behavior, and so this is called Anti-Clericalism, and that's really what this question is about. And again, it's about looking at the evidence presented that we have on the church and its members, and from Chaucer himself. And that could be canon law, or it could be court cases or ecclesiastical court cases, things of that nature. Next one is to contextualize Chaucer's sense of humor with regard to 14th century bawdiness and marginalia, and that's that issue of satire that I raised earlier, and how it's present in a lot of art, carvings in particular, but the marginalia in text. These are the drawings in the illuminated manuscripts, and it's present in Chaucer as well. So really this is asking, what does this say about the society, and how can we evidence that, and what what are the secondary source arguments. Next one is, are the Canterbury Tales a clear or distorting mirror of the late 14th century English society? Fiction in any era has been described as a speculum mundi, a mirror of the world, and Chaucer is no different. So you'll be asked, in that question you're asked, is Chaucer giving a clear or distorted image of his own time? Again, you have to try and answer that with recourse to the evidence that's available, limited though it is, and taking examples from Chaucer. So you have to limit that. You would need to limit that to a number of examples that are relevant. The next one has the quote, "He loved chivalry, truth and honour, freedom and courtesy. To what extent is Chaucer's account of gentilé critical of the political elites of his day?" Gentilé is a kind of behaviour expected of the upper classes. We find the treatment of this particularly in the Knight's Tale, but not just there. Is it a criticism of the elites of his era, or is it actually upholding the social structure, or is it impossible to say because Chaucer hasn't told us? Again, we want specifics, we want evidence, we want examples, and a coherent argument. None of these questions should be answered with a kind of potted history or just a descriptive narrative. This is an argument needs to be made, something has to be proven or demonstrated, and historiographical debates need to be taken into account. Next one, how does Chaucer treat old age? Was he typical of his times? This is again relevant to the era because with so many people having died of the plague, it's reckoned that more than half of the living people at the end of it were under the age of 25. So there are still older people around, and those who survive the plague do quite well. But you can imagine a society in which a lot of people have died. There are some old people with lots of money, and there are young people who are up and coming. Are the old people taking advantage of it? So you get the notion of the Synex Amons, the aged lover, who because of his wealth is able to get a younger partner, and then what are the sort of consequences from that? The best example being Edward III, who in his dotage, in his rather extreme old age, took up with a young 20-something, and not just one, but multiple younger women. And one of them in particular, Alice Perrers, whom I've mentioned, exerted a great deal of influence over him. So that's what that's really about. How would you characterize Chaucer's representation of the late 14th century church? That kind of recollects the earlier question about Chaucer's representation of the church, but gives it a slightly different spin. So again, we want concrete examples, looking at his characters, and can we compare those with ones in real life? How did the Black Death alter English society by the end of the 14th century? This is a big one, and one that a lot of people tend to take. Again, you may be inclined to answer this just with a grand narrative, but don't. You need to find specific examples. Yes, it's important to talk about the plague itself, what we know about it, how it impacted society. There are lots of resources on that, but we don't want just a long narrative description of the plague and then what happened as a result. We want cause and effect, argument, interpretation, and there's plenty of interpretation in the secondary scholarship for you to take into account. Next one, what were the causes of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, and what were the consequences? So again, you could also answer this with a grand narrative, but don't, because it won't get you a very high mark. I don't want to hear everything that happened prior to the Peasants' Revolt that may have been a factor, with an implicit kind of argument about how it's all connected. We want arguments and interpretations from the secondary scholarship backed up by evidence from the primary scholarship. What are these interpretations? Do you agree with them? Are they right? Are they wrong? Does the evidence support it? And what do you think? And again, I'm happy to discuss this in more detail with people as time goes on. Next one is there a subtext to the Canterbury Tales that reflects issues relevant to Chaucer's era? Subtext is always a very difficult thing to prove. It's a text below the text. It's a hidden argument or agenda. Can you evidence it? Well, it's tricky, but maybe you can. And again, this will come down to a close reading of the Canterbury Tales. And again, you need secondary historiography to back that up. Was Chaucer in his Canterbury Tales advancing a feminist agenda? Well, he wasn't, because feminism didn't exist. But there was something called anti-feminism at the time, which was a kind of based largely on the kind of biblical Adam and Eve story, an argument against women, a way of keeping them in a subordinate position. And Chaucer may be said to have embarked on what's called Proto-Feminism, potentially a kind of early form of arguing for equality. And again, you have to evidence this. The wife of Bath may be taken as evidence, but I'll point out the wife of Bath has been regarded, and there's even scholarship going back to the 18th century, pointing out how she's actually a very negative woman, a negative image of women, but then that reflects attitudes at that time. So worth thinking about, can you make an argument and interpretation about that? What was the social, psychological, or religious function of secular marginalia? Well, this picks up on the marginalia again. Marginalia, again, being this artwork in the margins, but it could also include stained glass windows, misericords, carvings, things like this, which are often in a religious context but have a secular depiction. So, why marginalia? What's the point of it? And that's a very hard question to answer, but again, there is scholarship on it, and you'd want to discuss examples of it as well. The next one is discussing aspects of Gothic decorative art that are most relevant to an understanding of 14th century literature. How does the Gothic style, why is there a Gothic style in the first place? How does that relate to the literature? What is its sort of historical context? And again, in the background of the Black Death, that's part and parcel of it. Are hybrids and grotesques in Gothic art simply a joke, or do they reveal something deeper about the culture that produced them? Nobody ever answers this question, but it's an interesting one. This sort of, again, delves into the marginalia, and you find hybrids and grotesques. These are like half man, half beasts, or half multiple different creatures put together. Mermen, things like that on the land. What are they about? What do they indicate? It's a question of finding scholarship on it, and looking at arguments and interpretations and evidence. Once again, it always comes down to the evidence. 15. Assess the strengths and limitations of the Canterbury Tales as an historical source. Again, highly relevant to what we're talking about. How much can we trust a work of fiction to tell us about the 14th century? And obviously, it all has to be taken with a grain of salt, but we want specific examples and arguments about them. Discuss the social phenomena of the pilgrimage in historical context, and consider whether Chaucer's portrayal of pilgrimage accurately reflects the reality as we understand it. Pilgrimage was a big deal in the Middle Ages, but it wasn't just spiritual. It was a kind of it was almost like a holiday for some people, but also a status thing. It's like how we will go on holiday today and take Instagram photos. Well, pilgrims would go on pilgrimage and collect trinkets and icons and things like that to prove that they had gone. It was a status thing as well as a religious thing. So that would be the subject of that essay question, and again, it has to be backed by evidence. Last one. What do Chaucer's own historical experiences, perhaps referenced in the Canterbury Tales, tell us about life in the 14th century English court? So you would, again, need to find examples where Chaucer has perhaps highlighted his own experience. There are actually quite a few in the Canterbury Tales, or has discussed something or has presented something that relates to courtly life that he might have experienced. And as I say, that there are several that you would need to pick out and then compare and contrast with what we know of Chaucer's own experience and make some kind of argument about that and what life was like in the court. As I say, we don't want a narrative description. We want argument and interpretation. It needs to be about those things, and it needs to be about the evidence. And I shall leave it at that today. So these are the themes we're going to be talking about, the big topics, and for the seminar session we can go over some of these in greater detail, and answer some of the questions and talk about procedural things, and so forth. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. I shall look forward to seeing you all in the seminar.